And that's not to say that there aren't causes and conditions that affect us and that we all don't want to focus on trying to, you know, level the playing field for all human beings as much as we possibly can. But we're still all making choices all the time. And so these ideas are been around for a long time. But the important distinction is between ownership and blame. Because radical responsibility is obviously not about blaming others, but it's also not even one iota about blaming ourselves. That's not helpful at all. It's not about blaming ourselves.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Men on Purpose podcast. Our mission is to elevate, educate, empower, enrich, and evolve men to be on purpose, right? To live the best life possible, the most authentic life possible with no regrets. But it's not just for men. It's just me as a man on purpose interviewing men on purpose, right? Who are on purpose, and I'm interviewing them on purpose, asking questions about how they changed who they were, grow or evolved who they were to become this person and have and do what they do. It has to start that way. It has to be being before doing. Always, 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 always. So you're wondering, what are we going to talk about today with this super exciting guest? I'll tell you. We're going to be talking about how to move beyond blame, how to fearlessly live your highest purpose, and how to become an unstoppable force for good. Sound good? Cool. This guest is Dr. Fleet Maull. And before I tell you about him, because he is impressive, really impressive, and this episode is like, wow, mind-blowing. So before I tell you about Dr. Fleet Maull, let me just fill you in on a couple really cool things we got going on. Remember, our Facebook community, the Men on Purpose community, again, not to be confused with Men on Purpose podcast community, which is totally different. The Men on Purpose community is a phenomenal resource. I call it an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem for all of us people who are on purpose, to find other people who are on purpose, to collaborate with, to network with, to talk about the things we're experiencing, to talk about our challenges and the way that we're solving them, to talk about who we're becoming, our missions in life, our purpose in life, our visions we have for ourselves, our families, the world, our money, our relationships, you name it. That's the ecosystem that we're creating. Just like we created a cool ecosystem with this podcast, we're taking that same concept and we're putting it over into the Men on Purpose community on Facebook. You'll love it. It's free to join. There's tons of giveaways. There's coaching in there. There's videos. Obviously, it's new, so I'm building it. But like by the time you listen to this, there will be some really amazing resources in there and a lot of great people who don't want the normal old mastermindy, seminary kind of, just exist in it and pretend like something's actually happening. There's real stuff happening in this community. There's real stuff happening on this podcast because we're on freaking purpose about it, right? Okay, let me tell you about the guest. Dr. Maull, he's an author. He's a world-renowned growth mindset and meditation teacher who delivers his training programs and seminars around the world, both in person and online through his company, which is called the the Heart Mind Institute. He's an executive coach. He's an inspirational leader and speaker, and he's a social entrepreneur who works at the intersection of personal and social transformation. He founded the Prison Mindfulness Institute and National Prison Hospice Association, catalyzing 2 national movements while serving a 14-year mandatory minimum federal drug sentence from 1985 to 1999. So Dr. Fleet developed the radical responsibility empowerment model that embraces 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face, free of blaming oneself or others. There's like 15 more paragraphs I can read. Don't let his interview minimize the intense work and the depth and the global reach that this guy is doing for this planet, for people that are suffering, for people that are being victimized, for people that are incarcerated, that can't speak for themselves or just don't have that internal mechanism. This dude's doing a serious force for good. And as you know on this podcast, we keep leveling up the guests. Every guest, we're leveling up. We're keeping leveling up because we've got to deliver you the best possible information, right? So that we can educate you, elevate you, empower you, enrich, and evolve your life through this content. If you choose to or not, it's your call. But we appreciate you listening. If you need more information on what we're doing in our coaching business, our mission for this planet, or anything else we're doing in our purpose in our lives to help yours, hit the website up, ianlobas.com, and hit up mentalpurposepodcast.com if you want to learn more about our guests, any guest, the podcast, or what we're doing on that mission. All right? This is Dr. Fleet Maull. Enjoy yourselves. All right, Dr. Maull, let's do this thing. We're going to talk about some very interesting subjects today. And before we do that, though, I want to get into your background because you have a very interesting past. And I'm guessing, and we're going to learn different maybe, potentially, or we'll learn more, that your past created this person and this movement that you've built, and I think that's really fascinating. So let's talk about that. Tell me about your past. I mean, the stuff you got into and where you ended up.
Yeah, thank you, Ian.
Sure.
It's yeah, I have a kind of a classic checkered past. Um, so I was one of those individuals that came up through the 60s, a baby boomer coming of age in the 60s and early 70s with kind of a dual major. On the one hand, I was always a spiritual seeker. I'm not sure why, but from very early on, and very interested in the mind and spiritual things. And at the same time, I went headlong into the counterculture and the drugs, sex, and rock and roll, all the craziness of that era. I think I really came of age with kind of a typical angry young man with a big hole in my gut that I was trying to fill up with anything and everything I could. And, just early childhood stuff, whatever. I mean, I grew up in a good family, but there was alcoholism in my family, and, that creates various splits and everything. But anyway, suffice it to say that I really went headlong into that counterculture of that time. And, so I had these kind of twisted parallel paths going on, and before I could untangle it, I earned my way into a federal prison sentence. Um,
Wow.
and I was indicted for smuggling cocaine from South America, which is something I'm not proud of at all, obviously.
Sure.
I have a lot of regrets about my involvement and all that. But I do feel good about what I did with my time once I did end up in prison. I was I'd actually, prior to getting indicted and going to prison, I'd been training deeply in a Buddhist path of meditation, and as a meditation teacher, I'd gotten a master's degree in what was then called a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology. The same program is now called a master's degree in contemplative psychotherapy, and it was a 3-year, very intensive clinical training program. Um, Integrating the best of both Western and Buddhist psychology. And so I landed in prison with a lot of skills, a lot of background, and didn't make it any less shocking or difficult,
Sure.
but it did allow me to have that be an incredibly transformational time for myself rather than it being something that actually would, I mean, the vast majority of people that spend significant time in prison come out worse than they went in. And
Yeah.
it's a very debilitating, dehumanizing, destructive environment, really. But because of the resources I went in with, I was able to use the time well. And actually, when I got sentenced, I was indicted on this so-called kingpin statute, and I really to this day don't feel I was anything anywhere near a kingpin. And I was broke at the time. I haven't met too many broke kingpins, but um,
Right.
uh, at any rate, I refused to testify, and that's why I became the person, and lots of other people were willing to testify, and it's kind of the way it works. And it wasn't that I was trying to be a stand-up guy or anything. It was that it just didn't align with my Buddhist values that somebody else was gonna go suffer in prison, and their families and children were gonna suffer, so that I wouldn't have to go to prison or could do a lot less time in prison. That just didn't line up with my
Sure.
values. So at any rate, I was really originally sentenced to a 30-year no parole sentence, and I was 35 years
Wow.
old. In the paper the next day, it said I would be 65 before I'd have any chance of release. So I pretty much thought my life as I'd known it was over. And
Yeah.
I was absolutely devastated because of what I then realized I'd done to my son, who was 9 years old at the time, was now going to grow up without a dad. And as it turned out, once I actually got to the federal prison, I was in a hellhole of a county jail for 7 months going through trial and sentencing, which was just an absolute hellish experience. But once I got to the federal prison, which was kind of a relief because it was actually a big place and you could get a job and there was recreational facilities and a yard, you could get outdoors and so forth. Um, but also, after being there a while, I realized actually it took me a while to figure out the legalities of my sentence. That if I managed to stay out of trouble, there was a lot of good time, what they call good time available. And prior to 1987, there was significant what they call statutory good time, and then also good time that you get by just staying out of trouble and keeping a job in prison. So it turned out that on 30 years, if I managed to stay out of trouble and kept a job, I would have to serve about 18 and a half years. Now, it still, of course, felt like
Wow,
forever, right?
that's a long
And
time.
and then I appealed, of course, my sentence, and because I really didn't feel I was guilty of the charge that carried the no parole penalty, the so-called kingpin statute. I would have pled guilty to all the rest of it if they hadn't charged me with that. And so, at any rate, on my appeal, they did knock off that count, but they knocked off one other, so that reduced my aggregate sentence down to 25. And then at that point, I knew I'd serve 14 and a half. So that was about I don't know, my appeal took 2.5 years or so to go through the courts. So by that time that I knew that, I still had like 12 and a half years to go, and that still felt like forever, obviously.
It's a
And of
long
course, there
time.
was no guarantee that I would survive that time. I was seeing people die all around me, somewhat from violence, but also because I was doing my time at the maximum security federal prison hospital and in the heights of the AIDS epidemic, and people were dying all around me from AIDS and cancer and liver disease. And I saw people, even in the general population there, get sick and end up in the hospital and dying there. I was in what they called the general population or work cadre there just to help run the place. And because I had an education, I got a job in the school teaching school. So my day job for 14 years was helping other prisoners learn to read or earn their GED or study for college classes or learn English. And that was my regular day job for 14 years. So, but when I arrived there, as you can imagine, I was pretty caught up in my own drama, right? Thinking
Sure,
I'm going to
sure.
be in prison forever. I've really just torched my own life completely. I felt like I really let my family down, let my spiritual teacher down, let my community down. I was devastated over what I'd done to my son and recognized all the incredible selfish decisions I've been making for so long, putting my son's life at risk and his mom's life at risk. And so I was really caught up in that drama. And then I get to this federal prison hospital, which was when I first got there, I remember it felt like I was in a Fellini movie because, just such suffering all around me. And,
Yeah.
this is a maximum security prison, and seeing prisoners being helped down the hall who are blind or being wheeled around in wheelchairs who were paraplegics or even quadriplegics, seeing men doing the Thorazine or the Halidol two-step down the hall, from the psychiatric ward and over-medicated with psychoactive drugs and so forth. I mean, it was just really a hell realm, and there was so much suffering that it
Polarizing.
completely woke me up from the drama of my own situation. And because of the training I'd had, it really just I shifted my focus. Okay, here I am. How can I serve here? This is going to be my community for some
Yeah.
long period of time. So how can I best serve here? And that started a path of deep transformation.
It sounds a lot easier. It sounds a lot easier as you say it than it was. And I'm just really curious. When I have a friend of mine who went to prison for 2.5 years for something, and he was on this podcast, and we were talking about it just in private, the mindset shift and the realization that this is now your life, and the more you try and fight it, the tighter the constraints are going to get, the tighter the straitjacket gets. Not really, not literally, but figuratively. How do you take that, you know, let's say take the drug kingpin out. You were doing some stuff, you were making some money, you had some freedom, you had some things in your life. But then you go from that to broke to jail. How do you stage your mind through that being in captivity at that point? And your freedoms are gone and you're facing 30 years and you have all these things, not only the your life, but your child's life who's not affected, your relationship with your wife is now affected. And now you're seeing not only that, like if you were sitting in the woods alone and you just were sentenced there, it'd be different. But now you're seeing this pain and this like just disgustingness of the correctional system and the treatment of people. And how do you process that?
Yeah, well, it is really challenging. You know, when I was in the county jail going through trial and sentencing, my mind was just pretty crazy. And I was, just constant nightmares. I couldn't sleep because in this jail, I was in this sort of concrete and steel tank, five two-man cells, so 10 men in this little tank, and just a slit in the door that they passed the meal trays through, and they let prisoners there have radios and TVs if their family brought and gave them to them. And then the tank across the out the door across the hall was state prisoners, and they were always beating each other up and screaming and yelling, and the TVs and radios were blasting all the time. And there was a crew that stayed up all night watching movies and telling war stories. There was another crew that got up in the morning and watched cartoons, and another crew that watched the soap operas all afternoon. I mean, it was just crazy, and my mind was just full of panic and fear. Like you feel like you're, literally the rat caught in the trap, and you're just
Mm-hmm.
desperate to. Is there any way out? And you're kind of racing back. What could I have done, or what could I do, or and you're almost ready to chew off your own leg, right, to get out of the
Yeah.
trap. So my mind was crazy like that, and I remember
Yeah.
when I'd be taken to court. Um, the U.S. Marshals they put me in a county jail way down, and my trial was in St. Louis, Missouri. They put me in a county jail like a 3.5 hour drive south, which meant my lawyer was going to see me like once.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but when I did go to court, the U.S. Marshals would drive me back and forth, and I remember sitting in the back seat of this car with the two marshals in the front seat, and my mind just racing with escape fantasies, right? And thank God I didn't do some of the things I imagined or fantasized doing, or I'd probably
Sure.
still be in prison, right? So, but my mind was nuts like that. But fortunately, I had a meditation practice. I knew how to work with my mind. I've been trained for the last 10 years in working with my mind. And the meditation training was very much about working with my own mind. My master's degree was about supporting people who are experiencing extreme states. So I had a lot of training, and so I was able to just hang in there with it. And I knew that I really had to practice. And I would sit on the upper bunk. I kept an upper bunk, even though with seniority you could get to a lower bunk. I stayed in the upper bunk because there was room to sit up there, and I could practice at night. And I'd be sitting up there practicing meditation. And at one point, I remember having the experience that, it was just bedlam, noise, chaos everywhere. And I just suddenly realized there I was sitting, my mind was completely calm and still, and it wasn't being pulled by any of that. And it was aware of it, but it wasn't being pulled or disturbed by any of it. And I had lots of experiences like that before in various meditation retreats and so forth, but never in that kind of extreme circumstance. And
Sure.
when I had that and was able to just kind of rest in that, I got this wave of kind of confidence that came over that didn't get rid of the fear, but it did. I did realize I can do this. I can do this, and that was very helpful. And so as I arrived at the federal prison, I decided to make practice, my meditation practice, the core of what I was going to do there. And if I was going to be able to help anybody, I realized it was going to come out of my practice, not out of some strategy or something. And so
Yeah.
I just really focused on practicing hours a day, working with my own mind. And of course, then that environment becomes this really rich landscape for practice. I mean, it's incredibly challenging. It's like, it's
Mm-hmm.
one thing to go off and learn to meditate and develop calmness in a quiet Zen monastery somewhere in ideal
Yeah.
surroundings, but it's another thing to do it in the middle of a crazy prison.
Do you think that, as you were saying that, I was thinking about your mission and how big it is, and the things that you do for the world, and I think about my own mission too. Do you think that you have to have that level of duality in your life to be able to get to the level and reach the heights that you have in your current life? Do you think that's? I mean, it's not like a given. It's not a constant. It's just I'm just wondering, would you be? And obviously, you don't know the answer to this. This is speculative, but do you think you'd be the person that you are today without that type of experience? And do you think you'd be able to to understand surrender and mindfulness and presence and those sort of things without that like extremely polarizing experience you went through?
Well, I definitely wouldn't be the person I am today without having gone through
Sure.
that experience. Yeah, I mean, it's just hard. I don't know where I would have ended up, but I mean, even if I hadn't gone to jail, I was really committed to that meditation path, and I probably would
Sure.
have done all right. But I certainly wouldn't be the same person I am today. It'd be something. I don't know. Maybe there would have been other challenges that I would have stepped into. I've always been kind of, that's part of what got me in trouble was I was really looking for something that was real, and I was willing to take risks and really step into life, right? Because early on in childhood, everything kind of just went gray tones, and I remember it being a very young child, everything was really real and vivid and kind of magical, and then it went gray tones, and I never made peace with that. So I was
Hmm.
looking for something real, and that took me down a lot of twisted paths. And eventually, I was able to really find it through contemplative practice. But along the way, but so I mean, I think something in my life would have always pulled me to those edges of
Sure.
learning. But certainly, where I ended up and being in prison completely transformed my life and who I am today and what I'm able to bring to the world and the
Sure.
consciousness I have about it and it was very influenced, though, even when I got to that prison, that decision to focus on how I could show up and serve in this crazy environment, um, there was a mixture of things there. One, the influence of the family I grew up in, a basically solid, good family. We had our problems with alcoholism and different things, but still a lot of good values and community focused and so forth. And then my first spiritual teacher, the Tibetan master Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who, as far as I could see, just lived his life 24/7 in service of humanity. And he had no other interest in life other than helping people wake up and overcome suffering. And so I had those examples behind me, kind of. And then I also saw when I got to that federal prison, one of the standard rituals when you meet another prisoner, you might go for a walk on the yard, and usually they tell you their victim story, then you tell them your victim. My fall partner ratted on me, and my lawyer screwed me over, and da 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 da, and that's just kind of the ritual. And after I went through that 2 or 3 times, I didn't want to hear my story anymore at all. I really didn't want to hear their stories either. That's not very compassionate, but it's
Sure.
just not where I wanted to be. And I realized I was in a world of tremendous anger and bitterness, and it's quite natural because when you get arrested, the system just starts, it's just set up that way. It starts kind of trying to bury you in a mountain of guilt and
Squeeze you.
shame and demonization.
Yeah.
And so naturally, trying to survive, just for your being to survive in that, we armor up, right? You armor up with anger and
Sure.
bitterness and your own victim narrative and so forth. And so I realized that's the world I was in, and also it was a very racially polarized world, and it was just and I knew there was a real danger that I could end up becoming a really negative person, and I didn't want to come out of prison that way, broken, negative, bitter, and I didn't want to live that way while I was there. So I realized I had to proactively do something different. So I think it was the influence of my background, my family, and my spiritual teacher and community that helped me really make that shift into service and realizing
Sure.
I'm here, there must be a reason. And then it was also out of realizing I needed to proactively embrace responsibility for having got myself into that situation and what I was going to do with it was really the birth of the radical responsibility philosophy that finally emerged as my book a couple of years ago. That I realized that really the only way through and out for me with this experience was to embrace, 100% or 200% radical responsibility for having got myself into that place and then what I was going to do with it. And I constantly decided to let go of the rest of it because, I had all kinds of people I could have, brought into blaming my situation for. I
Of
mean,
course.
when you're involved in a federal drug case, they don't play by the rules. They play hardball. They break all the rules and I had tons of people decide to have me do their time instead of them doing time, right? So I could have I could have focused on all that and just been a victim and gotten bitter
Sure.
and angry and all that. But it's not who I wanted to be. I just didn't want to be that. And so I really made this conscious choice to live differently. And everything I was able to do during those 14 years in the prison and the programs I started, the national organizations and movements I was able to start from in there, all came out of that sort of philosophical approach.
So your situation is just an extreme, but really what you're talking about is our basic philosophies for life anyway. Our society is much like that prison. Again, more polarizing, more extreme. However, most people, and I had somebody on yesterday who was in the tail end of a world war, living in Eastern Europe at that time, and in Poland, which obviously we know what happened there. And there are conscious decisions that he made. There are conscious decisions that you made. You definitely, the way that the world brings you up, and the way the world and our correctional system and our prosecution system, the way that that blames you and makes you, it creates your identity, kind of like the rest of the world creates your identity, through no responsibility, through lack of accountability, through yeah, this happened, but that person did that. I mean, we saw that with the last election. I mean, it was horrific to watch. If I ever caught it by accident, the people speaking on TV, it was sickening and sad, and it's just sad because nobody had accountability. But what you're talking about isn't necessarily because you were in jail. This is how you decided to show up as a human being, right? And it's
Yeah,
what you're saying
absolutely.
in
And
there.
I want to make an important distinction in the radical responsibility model. And there are other. I mean, these ideas have been around for a long time. I mean, there's been a
Sure.
resurgence in the philosophy of the Stoics. There's a modern Stoic movement, and
Yeah.
there's a great online community and kind of podcast world called the Stoa. And this is this idea that living at choice and taking responsibility for the choices we're making and the impact that's going to have on others, the consequences it's going to create for ourselves. And that's not to say that there aren't causes and conditions that affect us, and that we
Sure.
all don't want to focus on trying to, you know, uh, level the playing field for all human beings as much as we possibly can. But we're still all making choices all the time. And so these ideas are been around for a long time. But the important distinction is between ownership and blame. Because radical responsibility is obviously not about blaming others, but it's also not even one iota about blaming ourselves. That's not helpful at all. It's not about blaming ourselves. So often when I teach this experientially, I'll have people go into pairs and surface some kind of conflict or drama when they really felt victimized, and totally get into telling their victim story and just get into the energy of that so they really get connected with that energy. And then I'll ask them to make the shift and tell the ownership version of that. And I ask them to really look back into what happened and see if there's any way they can see that they caused it or contributed to it. Any way they can see that they even unconsciously may have set themselves up for it, playing out life scripts that develop in our childhood that we keep playing out until we don't. Or or is there some way that they just allowed it by, not paying attention, by not doing their due diligence, not having a contract, not, being a lazy communicator, or not having good boundaries, not speaking up for themselves, and many different things like that. So there's that whole part where we look into to see if there's any way I can own anything in a particular thing that I'm not feeling happy about, right? And and so that's really important, but it's not for the purpose of blaming ourselves. It's just for the purpose of learning. Because if I can see that here I am at point B, which I'm not happy about, and here are the
Right.
steps that took me to get from point A to point B, and I understand something about how that unfolded, well, I can do differently next time. I'm learning, right? I can take a different approach. And then there are going to be some circumstances that we can get as radically honest as we possibly can, and we just don't see that we had anything to do with it. Literally, it seemed like it just fell out of the sky, landed on our head. Everybody would agree we're completely innocent, victimized. And so, in this radical responsibility philosophy, I say we also own that. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, again, it's not about blaming ourselves, but it's just realize, okay, this landed on my head. I don't know why. I mean, you could get into things like past life karma, but even if that's true, and it is part of my Buddhist training, but still, it's like it's not something we can really connect with or
Right.
reach. It doesn't really make any difference. That was another being in that last. I don't remember who that person was. So that's kind of irrelevant, but well, it can actually be relevant if you
Sure.
have that philosophy, because then you maybe don't feel so victimized by life because you realize you are playing out some things from past lives, possibly. But anyway, take all that off the table It's not about blaming ourselves, but it's just saying, okay, here, this landed on me. Maybe this is something that shouldn't happen to anybody. It's horribly unjust, and it shouldn't happen to anybody. But here it is. It's in my lap. So at some point, the salient question is, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to let it take me down? And am I going to end up, in a victim mindset the rest of my life? Or am I going to find what is the most creative way I can respond to this to move forward in my life? And that could include seeking justice. But seeking justice from that position of being at choice and owning my choices is very different than seeking justice from the victim mindset. And so and also this model needs to be really girded in compassion because this is not about, when something terrible befalls someone going to them, well, you need to get off that, you need to get, no, that would be absolutely horrible. It's not, I don't feel it's for me to decide what anybody else should do. And when people are really terribly victimized, they may need a lot of validation. They may really have a need to have that validated, and they may need a lot of support. And who knows what their journey of transformation will be. But I think we can all see if somebody stays really stuck in the mindset of victimization, at the very least, it's going to be very limiting for their own lives, very limiting. So we would hope that at some point they find some way to transform that experience and move forward in their life. But speaking for ourselves, I would hope that at some point I'm going to realize, even in the worst possible situation, okay, what am I going to do with this? Here I am.
Sure.
What am I going to do
Sure.
with it? And realizing that my future is going to be determined primarily by what I choose to do with it.
Why is that so hard for people to understand?
Ha,
I talk to a lot of people, and I know that's a big question. I talk to a lot of people, and I'll say to them, imagine this. This is all on you. All of this is your fault. Somebody else did it. It's all your fault. Just imagine your thought process. Take your emotions and the blame and all that. And I want to go through that with you real quick. But you take that out. Why is that so hard for people to just say, you know what? I do see my fault in this. I do see the effect of my choices in this, whether you did or didn't do. I can see my effect, and I can also see how I could do things differently next time. Why is it so hard for people to just stop and not allow themselves to blame other people, take the responsibility and the accountability on, and say, yeah, I messed that up, and you know what? I take that fully on. This is what I can do next time. It's clear. Let's move on. Why do people want to live in victimhood and blame and all the external stuff that really doesn't move them forward, but it makes them feel better? But there's not a sustainability in that. There's not a movement or a advancement in that. Why do they want to stay put, in your
Well, I think
opinion?
there's a number of reasons. Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons, Ian, and I'm not sure I have all of them nailed down. But um, one thing is that, and even words like accountability and responsibility, a lot of us associate them with blame, which is
Sure.
why I feel it's so important to tease it apart from blame. So we
Totally.
associate it from blame, and we've all experienced being blamed in our lives, and we've experienced the shame that often comes along with that, right? And we've all, growing up, none of us come out of childhood unscathed, and we have tender hearts, we're vulnerable, and we've been blamed and shamed, and so we don't want to have that experience anymore. And we've also been enculturated, generally in the culture, that somebody's always at fault. And so, if something happens and I can't find somebody else to blame, then I'm going to have to blame myself. And I don't want to blame
Right.
myself. And I think I don't have any choice other than that. And, I've experienced enough blame and shame in my life. Thank you very much. So I don't want to do that. So we almost instinctually deflect blame. We just
Sure.
instinctually do it, right? And myself, I have that same tendency in my own psychology, right? Just to instinctually deflect the blame and want to blame someone else for whatever it is. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is that our culture, even though we have these ideas of personal responsibility running through on various levels within our culture, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but I feel that we also, what really dominates in our culture is a culture of shame and blame. And it's just all pervasive everywhere. And we have fear-based social institutions. We don't believe in the innate goodness of human beings. It's kind of that Calvinist twist on Christianity. Unfortunately, I'm not demonizing Christianity. I'm a Buddhist, but I'm a universalist, and I believe all the great religious traditions and philosophical traditions at their heart have beautiful
Sure.
essential wisdom teachings. But I think there was that twist that focused on the flawed nature of humanity and basically sees human beings as that we're absent the threat of some coercive force, like punishment or shaming, we're dangerous. And so we've created all our institutions are essentially, carrot and stick, punishment, reward, and shame based. And so it's so dominant in the culture that I think we're all sort of terrified of being blamed. And you see it again and again with the politicians and other people out in this public sphere. They'll just, that, they believe that deny till you die, deny till you die. And we've
Sad.
seen again and again why the person ends up in more trouble and their career further destroyed because they wouldn't own it, right? But they're just convinced if I own it, I'm going to die. If I own it, they're going to kill me. Now, the problem is there's some truth to that, especially in today's world of cancel culture and social media, that if you own up to something, you are liable to be annihilated for it, right?
Steward. Yeah.
So
Yep.
it's a really difficult world to ask people into accountability. And the other thing is that we've really elevated victim stature to being
Yep.
a place of identity and power, right? And really, I mean, in this upside down world we're in now, in the kind of postmodernist influenced landscape, and especially the landscape of the kind of so what sometimes people call woke politics movement that's capturing, the media and everything else. It's like everything's about having you know, one class or another of a victim identity that from which you can then wield power. And I don't mean to make light of the real suffering that's behind these things, but
Sure.
it's a kind of twisted ideology, and it's not helping us transform together as humanity, at least in my humble opinion. So there's a lot of reasons why we gravitate towards the victim mindset and why it feels too scary to embrace accountability.
Isn't there a what reminds me of is there has to be control, right? There has to be control in uh, uh, from a maybe an overseer, overlord, government, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same standpoint that the people can't run loose. You have to have victims. You have to have a victim mentality in some major part of the culture and of the society because if everybody took accountability for their own stuff, do they really need everybody else? Do you really need, it's funny, my dad and I last night we were watching my dad's out here with me in LA for his birthday, and we were watching the Game Show Network, and we were flipping between that and the Weather Channel because we were watching some crazy storm show. Almost 90% of the commercials were medications, right? Drug company commercials.
Yeah.
And the wackiest one I saw, and I'm not minimizing anybody's ailments,
Hmm.
but I'm still cracking over my head. My dad and I laughed our butts off. This lady came on and said, are your eyes falling out of your head? Basically, mine are. I have this problem, and I take this drug, and my eyes are going back into my head. And I thought, this has got to be. And am I in a twilight? Like, did I have too much sake tonight? Like, am I on a Twilight Zone? Is that a real commercial? But it's almost like it's manufactured because you have to be reliant on somebody for something, because if you can do it on your own, then there's no insurance company that's making tons of money, no drug company that's making tons of money. You're doing your own thing. And it was just funny to see, because I don't watch those type of shows. I don't have cable. I don't really watch TV. It was interesting to see how like the general population is marketed to as a victim culture almost,
Oh, absolutely.
or not even all.
Yeah, that's the basis of consumerism. We've been marketed
Totally,
to,
totally.
especially those who grew up in the modern media age. The message all along is you're not enough. You're not good enough. But if you buy this, you
Right.
might be. If you have this, you might be. If you have this, you might be loved. If you have this, you might be
Yep.
cool. You
Yep.
might be included or whatever. And, it's like that is the basis of the whole consumerist culture. And, there's a lot of complex forces at play here. I mentioned, woke politics. I don't want to just beat up on that alone. It's really this whole right-left culture wars thing because, the Radical Responsibility book, my first book really focuses on personal responsibility because I believe that's foundational to live at choice. The second book, which I'm working on now, is going to be about radical collective responsibility. And for me, it's always been about both. But in order to create collective responsibility, to take collective responsibility for for social justice, economic justice, racial justice, and to create as fair a playing field and even of a playing field as we can for everybody, and to have a just distribution of resources and so forth, and to do this in a way that really works requires personally responsible people to do that. In my view, I don't think personally unresponsible people can create collective responsibility. That's just my view. But at any rate, in our political landscape, the right loves to talk about personal responsibilities. Not that they are, but they love to talk about it, and they hate to hear anything about collective responsibility or systemic causes and conditions because they feel that's a slippery slope away from demanding people take personal responsibility. And of course, the left hates the word personal responsibility. I had a person in a dialogue I was at a meditation center when that term came up go into tears. It's like, you don't know how damaging that term is. That's been used as, and it's like, because they feel that any mention of personal responsibility is a slippery slope away from acknowledging the very significant causes and conditions that impact people, right? And it's clearly a both and issue, right? It's a
Yeah,
both
yeah,
and thing. But we stay back and forth in this war, and now we have the extreme. We never had the extremes so much in the
right.
mainstream as before. We have the extreme left almost having captured the mainstream media in the form of woke
Yep.
politics, and we have things like QAnon being legitimized on the floor of Congress. I mean, there's always been the wacko fringes of the political extremes, but, over the last few years, they've ended up in the mainstream. And the people that are
Yeah,
on the fringe now are the moderates, the kind of center
yeah,
left, center right people that can have a rational conversation. They're like off in these podcast worlds, they can't even
yeah.
participate in the mainstream because the mainstream is all about the war between these. It's gotten really crazy. And it's very damaging in the long run. So, there's we have to find our way behind beyond that, and I think it really is this some kind of shared ethos that I am responsible for myself, I am living
True.
a choice, and I am my brother's keeper, and I am responsible to the collective, and we have to do this together, right? And I believe that's entirely possible, and it's sad to see how things get so pushed into uh, this polarization, and really everybody's got a victim story. The people on the right have a victim story. I mean, if you look at what drives the Trump supporters, it's all a huge victim story that he plays into. And if you
Hmm.
look at what's driving the left, it's a big victim story that people that's just going to create perpetual warfare.
Totally. I won't get into any politics. I agree with you on that for sure.
And I,
I,
by, I,
I
by the way, I'm not diminishing the fact that people
no,
are victimized.
no. Oh, no, no,
People
no.
are people are victimized. Things happen,
I just,
but I'm talking
I,
about the way out.
yeah, 100%. And I've had these conversations with my friends, and I'm a middle guy. I see points on both sides. I see things that I don't like. I'm not really a politics lover. I don't really like politics that much. It's not just something that just doesn't interest me. And but I want to get more. I want to understand things, obviously, so I can be a smart voter and be a good member of society in that term. But what I don't get when I watch politicians from an ascended place that I have purposely gotten myself to by doing the work and owning the stuff that I'm choosing in my world and the consequences that come or the effects that come. I just simply cannot fathom how descended politicians, most politicians, look, I'm sure there's some good politicians out there, but the agenda and the damage and the trauma and the like when you watch these guys on TV, is it I mean, I that's my choice if it makes me sick, but it is kind of sickening watching a bunch of, 50, 60, 70-year-old men mainly act like 8-year-old boys on a playground that couldn't get on a piece of equipment or got their ball taken away from them. It's sickening because those are the people that make decisions for our society and our country. These people can't even agree on what soda is better. They have to argue. Would you say that is just their trauma, just a deep-seated trauma from childhood and society and school, and just the stuff that they've just never worked out, and they're working it out through their power struggle or their ego and being a politician and being somebody important? I mean, what is that about? It's so sad.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. And what you're seeing when you're seeing the politicians, and and yeah, yeah, I mean, we have for years seen a lot of older white guys doing,
Sure.
the landscape's changed a lot today, and it is male and female, and there's plenty of
Sure.
evidence of craziness on both genders, and
Oh, absolutely.
so uh, I almost subscribe to the view that if we just had all women in there, we'd have a better world. And maybe that's true. I'm not sure it's true, and I'm not sure we're
I
seeing
think
a
I would
lot of
agree with
evidence
you.
of that yet. Human beings are all susceptible to drama and all the rest of this. But I think what you said about trauma is right on. And it's not
Mhm.
even necessarily the individual trauma, although that's part of it. But I think it's collective trauma. It's collective
Mhm.
trauma. My friend Thomas Hubel has done a lot of interesting work. He's German and lives now in Israel, but he's done a lot of work. You mentioned a friend that went, somebody you interviewed that kind of went through the tail end of World War II. I've been going to Poland every year for about 20 years. We do a bearing witness retreat at the former death camp at Auschwitz and Birkenau. And we've been doing that every November for, I think, the Zen Peacemakers that I'm part of have been doing it for 24 years. So it started while I was in
Wow.
prison. I think the first one was in 1996. And I was able to go the year after I got out of prison. I've been going ever since. And so a lot of people here in the U.S. don't have the sense of how much collective trauma there is in Europe from the two world wars in the 20th century, and that it's very much still alive. We've been blessed, not that we don't have all kinds of issues for trauma in the U.S., especially for indigenous people and people of color, with the Holocaust of the Native Americans and with slavery and Jim Crow and all the rest of it. But at least we haven't had the major wars land on our shore, other than the fact that Pearl Harbor, the beginning of World War
Sure.
II. But in Europe, they've had these huge, massive armies just sweep across Europe one way and then the other way, and primarily the Russians and the Germans. But going back further, I mean, Europe has been a battleground forever, right?
Yeah, a
And
thousand
and so
years.
there's a lot of collective trauma there, and this collective trauma plays itself out. It plays itself out. And personally, I don't feel I have a profound belief that's part of my Buddhist tradition, but it's also become an experiential belief and faith for me in the innate goodness of all human beings, the innate goodness of life, the innate goodness of human society. That at its core, there's this innate goodness and workability, and when we trust in that innate goodness, I mean, if you really look at what do the vast majority of human beings all around the world do every day? They get up and they do their best to take care of themselves, take care of their kids, work, queue up at the well, queue up at the store, drive on the right side of the road. We're naturally very collaborative and partnering and even loving and compassionate if we feel we can get our needs met in a reasonable way. Now, when
Sure.
we get afraid that we can't get our basic needs met, then we can start acting in all kinds of untoward ways. So really what we want to do is lower the fear as much. The more human beings on the earth uh, are less fearful about getting their basic needs met, we're going to have a much more peaceful, much more workable society, right? And that points to the need for the collective work and the collective social justice work and overcoming the gross income disparities that we have now, right?
Hmm.
Because we need more human beings to feel safe and feel like they can get their needs met in reasonable ways. So, but that collective trauma plays itself out. And so I don't believe that violence is inherent to human nature. I believe that violence and all the other things that go on, the toxicity, the violence, the abuse, the oppression, all of that, I believe it's more like a virus that just keeps getting
Hmm.
passed around.
Spreads. Yep.
And and that we're carrying this unsustainable toxic load of internalized shame, oppression, and um, uh, in our human culture, and that it will always manifest as further violence until we kind of, you know, uh, to use the Trumpian expression, drain the swamp a bit, which is not what he actually did. But we need
No.
we need to heal a lot of that trauma that's already there, and then we need to stop traumatizing people. Every time there's another refugee crisis, another war, another genocide, another child experiencing some kind of abuse in their home, I mean, this is adding to that pool of collective uh, shame and trauma, internalized oppression and shame and trauma. And, it'll always keep manifesting as violence. And so we really need to focus on learning how to heal trauma and really focus on not creating more of it. Because what you're really seeing there, I mean, you could pick this particular politician or that person on TV and just feel it's,
Sure.
but really they're like the buds of the flowers coming out from
Yep.
the roots of our collective trauma.
So the question that I have is, you take Europe for example. And Europe's a good example because there are there are many centuries of war and fighting and killing and trauma and drama and wounds and how obviously the answer is you make the choice to. So I'll preface that Jeopardy. But how does somebody make that decision, or how does someone take the steps to stop the trajectory or change the perpetuation of trauma through the next generation? Now, I don't have a lot of trauma from my childhood, but I have trauma from my childhood because of the way that my brain interpreted things that my parents did or said, or the shame, man, the deep level of shame that I faced in school because I wasn't the kid that sat still. I like to ask questions. I like to challenge the authority. I don't think you know what you're talking about. I want to know how you got that answer, because you're telling me that's like the gospel, but I don't believe you because you're just standing up there, but you've never done this before. You're just reading in a book. I wanted to challenge that. And I was that bad kid. I was the bad apple. I was the kid that was never going to go anywhere. I was defiant and ADD. And my dad did, I think, a different job than my mom did. And my dad did a job that was like just a very, very accepting, where I think my mom and her trauma worried about what people were going to think. I have the choice to perpetuate that forward or stop it to my kids. And I chose to not let it roll forward by not reacting the same way that my parents did. Not that it was wrong, but I just don't think it served me as well as it could have. And there's nothing wrong that they did or bad that they did. They just did what they did. That's
Yeah.
how do you stop, besides just making a choice? Obviously, I've been working on personal development and spirituality and stoic stuff and Lao Tzu stuff for many, many, many years. But how does somebody who's just listening to this, who's at maybe like a level 2 out of 10, how do they not take that trauma from their childhood and perpetuate it to their children so that it just keeps rolling, like this 1,000 years in Europe
Right.
kind of thing, you know?
Well, I think one aspect of personal responsibility that I invite all of us to embrace, and it's been a huge part of my life, and you've just been referencing, is really just to do our own work. We all we all need to heal. We have the whatever trauma we experienced in our own lives and as children growing up, and nobody comes through childhood unscathed. We have generational trauma; it's in our DNA. We need to do our own healing work, and then hopefully participate in co-creating healing for others and our communities and so forth. So we need to do our healing work. There's a training that I've been privileged to lead for about 24 years now. Um, that actually I first uh, got in touch with it when I was in prison. The person who was leading that training got in touch with me through various reasons. Anyway, we got in a relationship. I managed to get the training into the prison. We did it in prison. I became a trainer, and I've been leading it ever since. And except for this past year, we haven't done it during the pandemic. And but it's an old school kind of very intense group process that takes us very quickly into our family of origin conditioning and helps us shift our relationship to it. So it's very kind of old school, very intense kind of training, and but it works and it's amazing. Every time I'm about to lead one of these trainings, it's called the event. Every time I'm about to lead one, I'm kind of, wow, am I really going to do this again? This is kind of crazy, really intense. But then every time when I get on the other side of leading one, I'm just so grateful for the work, because in that training, which is a very intensive training over 3, 4, 5 days, 12, 14-hour days, I actually see the link of the chain, the generational link break. I see people who are no longer going to pass on the trauma that they received from their parents and grandparents, that chain, the link is broken, and they're not going to pass it on to their kids. They're not going to pass it on to their coworkers or their employees or whoever. And I literally get to see that the link in the chain break. And to me, that is so powerful, and I have such gratitude to be able to participate in that. And so we have to find ways to do that, and there's no substitute for each of us doing our own work, our own healing work, and uh, and then we have to find ways to do that together. I'll just reference something.
Sure.
I do a lot of prison work, and I have a close friend that does prison work out in San Quentin and other prisons in California. And he does this amazing program called Guiding Rage into Power, or the acronym is GRIP. And they bring it was started in a male prison. They may be doing it in female prisons now as well, but it was started at San Quentin actually. And they bring men into a year-long community. They commit to being part of a year-long community doing this personal work. And anyway, in one of their sessions, one of the men sort of raised his hand and reflected that in response to something, he said, hurt people, hurt people,
Hmm.
hurt people, hurt people. And then another prisoner raised his hand and he said, yes, and healed people, heal people. Right? And I think that gets right to the nub of it.
Yeah, I've never heard it put that way. That's really interesting. I've heard the hurt people, never the heal people, which is that's very true. Can you imagine if we had a government full of people that actually did the work on themselves and didn't use their job or money? And that's such a prevalent thing in our society where, especially men that I have on this show, came from a place of your story is different, but men who came from a place of working and grinding and hustling and crushing it and making all this money and this feeling so empty inside because they thought that that's what they had to do to prove themselves to the world and their family and society. But can you imagine if we had a government, even local government, where people did the work, really purposefully did the work on themselves, and they weren't blaming, and they stood up to a mic and said, "Listen, I messed that up, and I'm really sorry that I let you down. If that's how you feel, or you feel I did, and this is what I'm going to do to not make that happen again." Like, I mean, I would be I'd be shocked. I'd be
Yeah.
shocked,
Well,
absolutely
it's
shocked.
entirely possible, but the work
It
has to
is
start as a groundswell of both individual and collective work, but we've got to make it safe for them to do that. Right now,
totally,
anybody in the public sphere, they just don't feel safe doing that. And it's hard to
yeah,
convince them to feel safe doing that. Their whole brain is going, if I do that, they're going to annihilate me. And there is some truth to it, actually. So we have to create a
100%,
world where it's safe for people to be honest and vulnerable and take responsibility. And that,
sure.
there's a lot of work there, but this is why are we here on the planet if not to do this work, And you've been mentioning, I know your show focuses on men, the work of another,
Sure.
I've been involved in that training I referenced called the event, which is both men and women involved in that. But I've also for a long time wanted to do the Mankind Project training, and I had the opportunity to do that a couple of years ago, and very transformative. And I think the work that movement is doing to try to help men be men, but also learn to live in their heart and be able to be vulnerable and live a choice and take that kind of responsibility while still, honoring the masculine and finding our
Yeah,
way into the deep, healthy masculine. So I think there's some really good work going on in the world. Unfortunately, it's not dominant. It's not what we see, but there's fabulous work of all kinds going on all over the world. And sometimes we need to connect the dots to that to have greater faith in humanity and hope for the future because what we see in the public sphere is everybody connecting the dots on all the negative stuff, right? And it seems like that's so
right.
dominant, but there's actually a lot of really good stuff going on in the world.
Yeah, you know what? It's like a reverse iceberg almost, where maybe there's a little bit more on top, and the iceberg is somehow staying upright because there's a little less on the bottom. But the stuff on the bottom is this stuff. I mean, think about just how the podcast world. Not all podcasts are out to help. I mean, there's some podcasts where
Right.
people just want to talk. That's fine, just to hear themselves talk. But think about this show, and I was saying this yesterday on an episode where I was very proud of when we opened up the Middle East, right? In the Middle East and their history of what men are and who men are and what they do and who women are and what they do. What if what if somebody hears this and creates a movement? I mean, what if you and I are a part of a movement that can move an entire culture's mindset and way of being? That's so cool. That's so awesome. So I think it's more unseen because the news media, public media has way more power, control, money, distribution. This is coming up though. This is definitely coming up.
Yeah,
And there's no
absolutely.
censorship here, which is nice.
Hmm.
I want to ask you one more question before we go, but go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that I think it's really important because I know I've been talking a lot about living a choice and
Sure.
embracing personal responsibility and then also collective responsibility. But it's also really important, I feel, to kind of marry that with compassion. with really cultivating deep compassion for ourselves, deep self-empathy and compassion. It's not about beating ourselves up into personal responsibility. The ground really needs to having, because it's no small thing being a human being. It's a huge challenge to be a human being. And we need to have profound compassion for ourselves and the struggle that we all go through. And we need to also have profound compassion for others. So I think it's somehow bringing together the ability to cultivate greater and greater self-compassion and compassion for others, and then also this capacity to embrace living at choice, and then from that place of personal responsibility to embrace greater commitment to collective responsibility and to the collective and common good.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's something that I've learned on my journey is compassion. And I didn't have compassion for others because I lacked it in myself. And I
Hmm.
didn't have compassion for myself because nobody else gave a shit about me either, in my mind. In my mind. And I had to prove myself by the money I made and the success that I had. And until I gave myself permission that I didn't have to do that anymore, I wasn't able to be compassionate for others until I actually gave myself a little bit of compassion. And that's what I talk about
Hmm.
in a lot of my episodes about being selfish is you have to be selfish. You have to take care of yourself first. You can't just keep giving to others and you're empty inside. It's the opposite way. But um, that's not a necessarily easy thing to do, kind of like what we were talking about in the beginning, which is the blame. Because, well, that person
Hmm.
didn't help me, so why would I help them? But my marriage, my business, this podcast, my clients, everybody's lives got, I think, um, more purposeful and better in the stuff that I deliver and the stuff that I am and the stuff that I do because of my level of understanding of compassion, especially for myself and for others. And
Yeah,
animals too. I've noticed that.
someone recently shared with me because sometimes we think of self-care as being selfish, or but
Sure.
they said they use the term self-stewardship, and I really like that because there's an image I've always loved called Indra's net, which comes from Indian cosmology, Vedic cosmology, that the idea of the universe is kind of this vast net, like a fishing net. And at every node on the net, like where they're tied at the little knots at those nodes on the net, that there's a pearl or a jewel that reflects all the wisdom and information in the whole net, which is kind of the idea of the holographic universe, Bohm's holographic universe. And it's kind of
Yeah.
now beginning to be manifested in the World Wide Web in a sense. Um, um, so at any rate, I tend to think of myself, my job is to be a good node on that net, right? To be a good node on the net and hopefully add at least as much value to the overall net as I'm receiving, and ideally more. Ideally, I'm adding more value than I'm receiving. And to do that, I have to take care of myself. To be a good node on the net, I have to take care of myself, right? Reasonably, right? So that
Yeah.
idea of self-compassion and reasonable self-care and self-stewardship, which is a term somebody just shared with me the other day that I really like.
Yeah. I really like that too. Well, listen, this has been a real eye opener, treat, and pleasure speaking with you, Dr. Fleet Maull. Say your last name for me, Maull, right?
Mall, mall.
Maull.
Hmm.
Fleet Maull. This has been
Yeah.
it's been an honor. It's a fast that was a fast hour.
Yeah, well,
But
great to meet you,
thanks for
Ian.
being
Thank you for
here.
having me on, and thank you for doing the work that you're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the pleasure's all on this side. And tell people where they can find you, find your book, and we'll have that stuff in the show notes. But tell everybody where they
Yeah.
can find Radical Responsibility and
Well, the
the stuff
book
you're
to
doing.
begin with is just radicalresponsibilitybook.com, radicalresponsibilitybook.com. And you can read all about the book there and the accolades from other best-selling authors. And you can download a free chapter right there. And then also you can order the book from there through Barnes& and Noble or Amazon or Indie Books, whoever you'd like to order it from if you choose to purchase. Then my basic website is just fleetmall.com, fleetmall.com. And so you can find a lot about my work there. I offer a lot of the seminars and trainings that I do both in person and online through my organization called Heart Mind Institute, and that's heartmindinstitute.co, not .com, but just .co, heartmindinstitute.co. And then the prison work that I do through an organization called Prison Dharma Network, which has four divisions actually. But I'll name three of them. Prison Mindfulness Institute brings mindfulness-based solutions for at-risk incarcerated returning youth and adults, and that's prisonmindfulness.org. And then the engaged mindfulness trains people in trauma-informed approaches to sharing the practice of mindfulness, especially with people and groups that are under-resourced and marginalized and where there is a lot of trauma often. And so that's engagedmindfulnessinstitute.org. And then today we do a lot of work, and a lot of my personal work out in the world is working with correctional officers, probation and parole officers, and police and other first responders and public safety professionals, and bringing them models to work in ways that are healthier for them and lead to enhanced performance and better outcomes. We call it mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency. And so that website it's the Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety, but it's just mindfulpublicsafety.org, mindfulpublicsafety.org.
I love it. Look, thank you for the work you're doing and for making that conscious choice to not be a victim based on the choices that you made that got you into prison. Like, think about that. I'm talking to the audience. Think about that. You went to prison and you could have blamed. You could have, the stuff we talked about today. But you made the choice, which got you into a place that you didn't choose to be in. That's just that simple. And then the stories and the stuff that you make up around it make it complicated. But you are a man on purpose and a force for good in this world, and I really support what you're doing, and I think it's awesome. And we'd love to have you back on maybe in like 6 months and just kind of give us an update of a little bit deeper into these different programs that you're running for people and the success stories that you're having of people just really transforming who they are.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to, Ian. I just wanted to throw one last wrinkle in. I made that distinction between ownership and blame. And one of the important reasons to tease those apart and to be able to embrace choice without blaming ourselves is when we have caused harm, when we have done things that have caused suffering or pain to others. And I was involved in very harmful activity, obviously doing drug smuggling. We need to get in touch with the genuine remorse and regret. And that really fuels our transformation. And regret is not about us. It's not guilt and shame like I'm a horrible person. Regret is, wow, I really regret that I had that impact on someone. I would change it, transform it if I could. I'd love to repair it. So regret and remorse are about the other person. And unfortunately, many people that get locked up in our criminal justice system, they're so focused on protecting themselves from all that shame and demonization that they can't get in touch. It's not safe for them to get in touch with their genuine regret and remorse. And I felt it was really, when I really, really got in touch with the harm of what I've been doing, after sitting in 12-step meetings in prison for a couple of years and listening to how many men's lives had just unraveled around drugs, any justification I'd ever had for being involved in that fell away. And I had to face that I'd been causing a lot of harm. And fortunately, I had the ability to embrace that with compassion and experience the regret. And that really became the fuel that wanted me to keep trying to become my best self and at least cause no more harm in the world and try to do good if I could. So anyway, it's right in there. The only reason I'm bringing it up because this whole thing around accountability and blame and shame and regret, remorse and ownership, it's really important to get in there because otherwise we just get lost in it's either blame them or blame me.
Right. Yeah, love that. Well, we definitely have more to talk about. So we'll get you back on. Dr. Maull, thank you so much for being here. And thank you, audience, for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you, Ian.